Hello, my name is Martyn Smith. I'm Professor of Toxicology and of Cancer Epidemiology at the University of California at Berkeley, and I'm going to talk to you today about the toxicology of arsenic. Now, arsenic's an interesting element because it's not fully a metal, it's a metalloid, and it's in the same part of the periodic table as nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as bismuth. You've probably heard of arsenic through its relationship to poisoning and to murder. And in episodes of crime novels such as Arsenic and Old Lace. The interesting thing about arsenic, of course, as a poison is that you can't taste it, you can't smell it, and you can't see it in the water. And so you would not know drinking a glass of arsenic containing water that you were being poisoned. It is, of course, through forensics possible to measure arsenic at very low levels in people, and so it's easy to determine if someone has been poisoned with arsenic. Now, occupational exposures tend to be in smelters, especially of copper ore within copper mines. Arsenic was used as a pesticide for many years. It's used in wood treatments, as I'll show in a minute. And arsine gas is used in the semiconductor industry. The wood treatments, 70% of homes use porches with and decks that contain preserved wood, which is typically preserved with a chromated copper arsenate. And so this contains chromium, copper, and arsenic, and is the green type of material you see on that wood. And many wood structures in playgrounds were found to contain this type of wood, and this new use has now been banned. But old structures are still present, and the arsenic and copper and chromium can leak from those structures. You'll find arsenic, as I mentioned, from mining and smelting, from the use of pesticides, and from play structures and the use of wood and semiconductors, but you'll also find it in your food. Chickens and turkeys actually grow quicker if they are given arsenic, and there is a compound roxasone which is used to increase the growth of chickens and turkeys. You'll also find arsenic as a natural product in many strains of rice and types of rice, as reported in Consumer Reports. You must really wash your rice well prior to using it in order to avoid arsenic exposure from rice. But most arsenic exposure throughout the world occurs naturally through contaminated drinking or groundwater or drinking water. And then arsenic is there quite naturally and present, and in many parts of the world there's many soils very rich in arsenic, including in California. So this just shows a map of worldwide arsenic exposure. I'll show you the United States in a minute, but throughout South America, Mexico, and throughout Asia, especially in the Mekong Delta and in the river Ganges leading to Bangladesh, there are many sources of arsenic soils which pollute the drinking water there. And it's thought that 30 million people, at least in Bangladesh, are exposed to very high levels of arsenic, more than 1 million in Vietnam, etc. Now, the situation in Bangladesh was made worse by the fact that the World Health Organization and others went into Bangladesh and introduced these so-called tube wells. Childhood illness and death from diarrhea and other foodborne illnesses were epidemic in Bangladesh because of this contamination of surface groundwater. So they drilled into the subsurface rock to get purer water out that was not containing infectious agents. The problem with that was that and this actually had a dramatic effect on lowering infant mortality, so a very positive effect in Bangladesh from when they did it in 1970 through to the 1990s. The problem with that was that these tube wells were found to contain high levels of arsenic eventually, and more than 35% of them contained over 50 micrograms per liter, which is a very high concentration. And some of them, 8 or 9%, contained very high poison type levels of arsenic of greater than 300 micrograms per liter. And it was found that when the population was studied, there were profound effects of arsenic going on in this Bangladeshi population as a result of this drinking water contamination. There is also arsenic in many drinking water supplies in the United States. It's in the northeast. It's New Hampshire that really has the most. But there are parts of Texas and New Mexico that have high levels of arsenic. There's also high levels of arsenic in California, especially in the foothills of the Sierras. In places like Susanville, we found levels of as high as 5,000 micrograms per liter. And Fallon, Nevada, is well known for having high concentrations of arsenic. Now, these are the mayor of Fallon and his wife Norma, who were not bothered by the high levels of arsenic in the drinking water. But as I'll show you, this can have serious effects, and they were quite lucky to avoid these effects in this town. This is also the town which I mentioned in my childhood leukemia lectures about, which has an epidemic of childhood leukemia that was not related to arsenic in the 2000s. Now, acute poisoning from arsenic will give you nausea and vomiting and diarrhea, but you also get hemolysis, and eventually you'll go into shock and die. This is the usual method for either being poisoned or taking arsenic for suicide. And in life-threatening conditions, the only treatment is really to try to chelate the arsenic out of someone. Now, more chronic types of arsenic exposure, such as those found in Bangladesh, has pretty gross effects. As you can see, you get this hyperkeratosis and hyperpigmentation of the skin. And this occurs mainly on the hands and feet. This is a common sign of high levels of arsenic exposure, which was found in Bangladesh and in Taiwan. Now, more chronic effects of arsenic include cardiovascular disease. It really damages the blood vessels. Diabetes has been associated with arsenic, COPD and bronchiectasis of the lungs. Even drinking water arsenic has profound damaging effects on the lungs, and it causes reproductive and birth defects. But the critical effect really for its regulation is in the fact that it is a known human carcinogen. It produces skin cancer. This was one of the earliest things described for arsenic, but the most profound effects are on the lung and on the kidneys and the bladder. And so if you want to look at the regulating arsenic, you have to look at its effects on lung cancer and these other cancers. Now, interestingly, there have been studies in the north of Chile, which we're going to ask you to watch a video about, which is in a town called Antofagasta, which is between the Pacific coast of northern Chile and the Andes Mountains. And it gets its water from the Andes Mountains, but it passes through the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert on Earth. And this is the Mars rover being tested there because it really looks like the surface of Mars. There's very little water supplies, and so the town had to really draw on very limited water supplies. And it was found that this town actually used a water supply that had a very high level of arsenic for around 12 years. And in the video, we're going to ask you to watch Dr. Craig Steinmaus, who conducted many of these studies with Professor Alan Smith at UC Berkeley, along with investigators from Chile. They show that there are profound effects of arsenic exposure before birth and in early childhood, which produce effects 30 to 40 or even 50 years later, and elevated risks of cancers and other types of diseases like bronchiectasis. So I hope you enjoy that video, and I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to the toxicology of arsenic. Thank you.